which I grew up in France, is a prehistory area. It's the Dordogne region where famous sites like Lascaux and Cro-Magnon and Le Moustier are located. And I visited those cave sites when I was a kid with my grandparents, and I think probably that was influential in scientific pursuit. And so I even changed universities to go to one that was stronger in paleoanthropology. Yeah, and that's kind of how it started.
You're the author of The Real Planet of the Apes, a book which details our hypothesis that our ancestors evolved in Europe before migrating to Africa. David, what is the story of this incredible migration?
Well, it begins maybe 20 million years ago or so in East Africa, where the earliest apes are first known, or at least where they're preserved in with sufficient quality and quantity so that we can analyze them and understand them. There were apes. The best known one was an ape called Akembo, which lived mainly, it's known from Kenya. And from that ape we know, and from other ones like it, we know that these apes were more monkey-like than ape-like. If you saw one in the tree, you would say that's a strange-looking monkey because it doesn't have a tail. And that was one of the things that distinguishes the Akembo from monkeys and tells us that it is an ape. There are also some subtle characters, especially in the hips and the wrists, but really they don't have a tail. They have a tailbone, a coccyx as it's known in anatomy, but they don't have a tail. And Akembo, sorry, we used to call it proconsul, and I slip into it every once in a while. Akembo was monkey-like. It scampered about in the trees, running on the tops of branches, eating soft fruits. And a little bit after Akembo, at around 17.5 million years ago, we get a new kind of thing, a new animal, a new primate, a new ape, that has very large jaws and teeth, especially powerful chewing muscles, quite different looking from Akembo. You can easily tell them apart. And we think that this ape, which is called Afropithecus, was able to exploit a wider range of dietary resources than Akembo, and therefore it could disperse across larger areas of the landscape, exploiting resources on the ground, for example, or harder, tougher resources, fruits and roots and nuts and things like that Akembo just couldn't get through because it had fairly slender jaws and teeth. So we think that Afropithecus, this dietary adaptation in Afropithecus allowed it to disperse, to spread into other areas further north in Africa. And eventually we have a very similar genus that's found in Saudi Arabia at about 17.5 million years ago. And then shortly after that, around 16.5 to 17, we start finding apes with robust jaws, powerfully developed jaws.
És hát igazából úgy tűnik, hogy a Kárpát-medencében történt meg az igazi áttörés, ahol akkor éppen a Pannon-tenger hullámzott. Tehát egy kánaáni körülmény volt, szubtrópusi klíma, tehát olyan, mint a dél-horvát-tenger parti körülmények. Ilyen állatokat is találtak a most már Rudapithecus Hungaricusnak nevezett faj mellett. Ezt Krecói Miklós fedezte föl, hogy ez egy hominida, tehát egy emberi lény, és ebből a neandervölgyi ősünkhöz egyenes út vezet. Tehát ugyanakkor, mivel ez az ősünk, ez 12-13 millió évvel ezelőtt élt Rudabánya környékén, hát nyilván több helyen is, csak ugye ezeknek a rokonait egészen az ibériai félszigetig meg lehet találni. De hát ezekhez kellenek olyan körülmények, ahol jól megmaradtak ezek a őslény csontok. Na most a jelenlegi DNS olvasási technológiánkkal viszont már egészen 1 millió évre megközelítettük ezt a 12-13 millió évet. Most ezeknek a nagy része már el van messzesedve, tehát sokkal nehezebb valószínűleg épp olyan DNS-t kinyerni, ami végig is olvasható. Viszont ebben is nagyon sokat fejlődött a technológia, hogy akár kisebb darabokból többször végigolvasva össze lehet állítani. Na most innen érdemes indulni, hogy 1 millió évre visszamenőleg viszont teljesen ismerjük az emberi genomot, sőt, volt már olyan próbálkozás, hogy ezt az emberi agynak egy bizonyos szerveződését helyre lehetett állítani neandervölgyi DNS-sel. Tehát élő organoidokat tudunk előállítani, amely neandervölgyi ősünknek az agy részleteit modellezik.
Tehát a hiányzó láncszemeket a meglévő DNS-ekből tudunk.
Igen, tehát valójában rendelkezünk olyan technológiával, hogy az 1 millió éves neandervölgyi ősünk tehát megszülhető lenne. Tehát ennek csak etikai körülményei vannak, és hát gondoljuk azt meg, hogy ki lenne az ilyen béranya. Ugye a béranyát találni, meg hát az egésznek a groteszk és etikátlan, tehát kidolgozatlan etikája akadályozza meg, nem a technikai lehetőségeink, hogy neandervölgyi ősünk megszülethessen.
De amit mondasz, és az adás elén feltártuk, hogy kiszabadult a szellem a palacból, akkor a Jurassic Park sem egy fikció, hanem minden további nélkül valahol már jó pénzért valamit trezorba őrzik ezeknek a őslényeknek.
Igen, a Jurassic Park ugye 65 millió évvel ezelőtt szakadt
de mély gyantába, vagy fenyőgyantába megtalálták már
Tehát szúnyogokban. Igen, borostyán és szúnyog. Igen. Tehát közelítünk ahhoz is, mint ahogy valószínűleg a Rudapithecus Hungaricus is előbb-utóbb ismerté fog válni.
If they branched off, they're the same age, right? They branched off from each other. They have the same length of evolution since their divergence. So that's nice that corresponds. And these first hominines are thinly enameled. They go back to looking more like a Kembo, superficially anyway, and they have relatively thin enamel, relatively more slender jaws again. They were probably soft fruit eaters. And that's probably because in Europe especially at the time, it was a subtropical environment. It was a lush, humid area. There was tropical vegetation with fruiting trees all year long, and so they didn't need the specialized adaptations to allow them, to give them the dietary breadth that Afropithecus had that allowed it to disperse into Europe and Asia. So they become these soft fruit frugivores for the most part. But the more important, or just as important, is that we see for the first time in these apes from Europe adaptations that look like modern ape adaptations for positional behavior, move, posture, and locomotion, which is that instead of walking on the tops of branches with their backbones horizontally oriented, they start to become more vertically oriented and look like apes. Apes have more vertical backbones, and they suspend themselves below the branches as opposed to walking on the tops of branches. And that's what these guys were starting to do. And we know this because we have some good skeletons of apes from Spain and from Hungary. And they all have the hallmarks of a suspensory animal. They all have large hands with elongated fingers that are very strongly curved. Their backbones show signs of being vertically oriented. Their arms are long. They have specialized attributes of the shoulders. They have a whole bunch of things, and that's not really controversial to say that they were suspensory. So that happened. So we're becoming more like African apes. And these animals, these apes, thrive in Europe. They're found in abundance, really, in northeastern Spain, in Catalonia. In Hungary, there's a relatively new genus Danuvius that I had the pleasure of being involved in the analysis of, from Germany. And there are other sporadic finds between Spain and Hungary, pretty much until about 10 million years ago, 10 million, let's say 10 million, that's pretty accurate. And then at around 10 million years ago, the climate starts to change. Well, it started to change a few million years earlier, but it finally caught up with the apes, and they started to move south as the forests were giving way to more grassland areas, grasslands like the Asian steppes of today. And the apes, we no longer find them after about 9.5 million years ago in most of Europe. What we're left with is a group of apes that has changed in their jaws and teeth, and they've descended from Western and Central Europe into Southeastern Europe, into the Balkan regions, and we find them mostly in Greece, but there are there's several specimens now from Bulgaria, and then of course the ones from Turkey that are a little bit later in time that we're going to get to. And these guys were adapted to more open country living, and they were probably forced into that from climatic changes that